Cool. Well, thank you all for coming. So I'm here to talk today a little bit about the work that I've been doing on livelihoods development in East Africa for refugee populations with an NGO that I co-founded with a few friends of mine when I was living in Rwanda called the Refugee Empowerment and Support Taskforce. Primarily we focus on a dignity-based approach to humanitarian response, which I'll get into a little bit later. However, it's primarily about engaging with communities directly, working to help them identify their needs and design programming as they see fit. So it's a bit of a human-centered design approach that we kick off through community organizing. But before I start, I'll start with where I am here. So I'm here at SIPA, obviously, but I'm studying human rights, humanitarian policy, and conflict resolution. And the experiences that I've had through the classes here, through being on the boards of UNC's working group, as well as Human Rights Working Group, and working as PA for the humanitarian program, have vastly affected the work that we're doing in our NGO. And one of the main reasons I came here to SIPA was to learn more about the humanitarian industry at large and use the experiences and opportunities here to leverage my past experience and create a path forward for both myself and also the work that we're doing and the approach that we're trying to take towards humanitarian response. And I think that since I've come here, the work that we've done has vastly changed, and I believe that we'll see that throughout this presentation. But getting to the point at hand, the rest, the Refugee Empowerment and Support Task Force. So in 2015, in February, there was the Burundi electoral crisis, where Pierre Nkurunziza, the president, didn't step down, and then there was a failed coup attempt, and violence around that electoral issue led to a mass migration or mass expulsion of people from Burundi. Around 380,000 in total left the country, around 70,000 of which settled in Rwanda, where I was working at the time. And so in March of 2015, I sat down with a good friend of mine, Edward Makara, who is one of the co-founders of our organization, and he expressed to me that based on his experiences growing up as a refugee in Tanzania, he wanted to take action and work with the Burundian refugees coming into his community, since he'd grown up in a town very close to the area where most of them were being resettled in Mahama camp. And so we sat down for lunch, Edward, myself, and another co-founder, Ryan Bowes, who was a farmer from Kansas at the time, working in a welding shop. And by the end of that lunch, we founded this organization. At first we called it the Disaster Response Initiative, and over time it developed into an NGO known as the Refugee Empowerment and Support Task Force, or the REST as we call it. We founded it on the belief that the world's leading experts on the challenges facing refugees and displaced peoples are those peoples themselves. I think that within the, I can't speak for everyone in this room, but for myself personally, I've never lived as a refugee or a displaced person, and I have no idea what that experience is like, and neither have the majority of aid workers. So for me, one of the questions that begets is why then are policies in the field driven mostly by external people working in largely developed countries rather than people living in these settings themselves? And so we founded the REST on that notion, and with a strategy to engage refugee and displaced populations and involve them within program planning from step zero, effectively. And so this here is Mahama camp, and as you can see, there's not a lot here. In the camp, people tend to live basically waiting for provisions coming from humanitarian donors, rather than having opportunities to engage in generating their own income or having control of their own lives. And we started this organization from a standpoint of trying to listen to people to see whether or not this was the preferred way of humanitarian response, or if they had any preferences on how they'd prefer that the humanitarian industry interact with them. And one thing that we talked about over that lunch with my good friend Edward was that he told us that for him, the worst part about being a refugee in Tanzania wasn't necessarily the lack of basic needs or waiting or being hungry or not having enough support. It was the lack of agency or control in his own life and the overwhelming sense of frustration and boredom that comes from just waiting for somebody to provide for you, rather than being given opportunities to take control of your own life. And that was a notion that was echoed by a lot of people that we spoke to in East Africa who had grown up as refugees, and people living in Mahama camp down near the border with Burundi, who came to us and said they were looking for people to engage with them in a more productive way and in a more sustainable way that was focused around engaging them and giving them the tools that they need to really regain control of their own lives and not be reliant on these major donors. And so one thing that we came to the realization is that living in Mahama camp isn't really living, it's more of just surviving. You're waiting, you have your basic needs met, but very little else outside of that. And we also spoke with several urban refugees living in Kigali who told us expressly one of the reasons they didn't register as a refugee in the country is because they would be put in a camp and effectively be stuck waiting, and they didn't want to give up that control. They would rather go and forge their own path in the city instead of being dependent on the system at large. And so our approach was, how can we work with refugees in this setting, as well as urban settings, and give them back that control? So we developed what we call the shoulder-to-shoulder model. It's built on a platform of community organizing, where we come into communities and approach them on their own level and listen, and just try to learn what they want and what their needs are as they see them, and work with them to collaboratively design projects based on those needs, as well as the strategies that they identify as being most preferential for them, and giving them the best opportunity to meet their needs as they see fit. Typically this will involve livelihoods development. It has been largely our programming, and we work with these communities to identify both supply and demand in certain markets in the area, as well as existing capacities and where they think they can make the best impact, and provide for themselves most effectively. And then in the third step, we provide funding for these community-led programs. It's a lot easier for us with our limited funding environment to provide for groups of 20 or 30 people for the same type of project rather than individual one-off programs. So we've used the community organizing model to it has reinforced that as well, since that's one of the foundations of the work that I was doing beforehand, involving community organizing and Rwanda for development. And then we follow up with communities to learn about the successes and failures and newer needs and existing needs, so that we can help meet those more effectively in the future. And it works as a cycle where we continue to have these ongoing discussions and dialogues rather than setting aside one-off projects, and working to, over time, develop better systems through which we're engaging with these populations. And these relationships are based on equality and not really a donor-recipient model. We give very, very little money, just seed funding, and then from that point we work with them to set up sustainable mechanisms through which they can continue to work. And that's not something that has come from us. That's something that's come from these discussions in this stage with refugee populations. One of the things that some of the women that we've worked with have come to us with is this idea that they don't want to be seen as dependent on us, which is one of the reasons why after initial grant-based funding, we tend to move towards more of a loan-based system at the request of these communities, since it's more about partnership and engagement rather than coming and us bestowing something upon them. And I think that's really important to this general idea of dignity and agency within humanitarian response, and treating them as people with capacity, and really as human beings rather than people who are waiting on a system. And I think it's really, really crucial to acknowledge that aspect from the information we've had from these communities. And so In 2015, when we started this project, we had a general idea of this shoulder-to-shoulder model, but we were largely amateurs, and for the most part still are, and we had no idea how we were going to go about implementing this programming. So we first tried to go to the camp in around April of 2015, and we had no letter, no advice from anyone within the country organizing this. Effectively, we had no idea what we were doing. And obviously, they told us we couldn't go into the camp. And so we had to go back and rethink our strategy. And so a month later in May, for the second time, we came after talking with the local authority managing Mahama sector, who'd given us permission and said that we'd be able to go in. We had our letter, we had the mayor of the sector on speed dial, and we managed to get into the camp for about 15 minutes before people came to us and asked what we were doing. Because while we had permission from the local government and the local cluster sector, we didn't have national level authorization. And by the third time, about a month later in May, everything was set up. We got all of our letters, everything done and dusted, and managed to finally get into the camp for just 2 days. And during those 2 days, we built connections with people. We started hosting one-to-one interviews, which is part of our community organizing model, and set the groundwork for larger community-based meetings and interactions. However, in just 2 days, there was very little that you can do. So we ended up meeting at this school that was about half a kilometer away from the main road towards the camp. And many women from the camp, and as well as a few men, would travel to meet us here, and we would start engaging with these community level meetings and these program planning. And I think it's important to note this process and these challenges because our model kind of came out of thin air. We didn't know what we were doing, and we were kind of learning on the fly, and that's been largely the first 2 years of our work until recently, has been figuring out as we go, which probably wouldn't recommend, having had some of the challenges and difficulties we've had, but it has shaped our process, and we've continued to improve based on a lot of the failures that we've had, as well as some of the successes. But just goes to show that we may have bitten off a little bit more than we could chew at the beginning, but over time we've gotten there. So this is how the model started to develop, is we have these small engagements with communities, both in the camp and local communities living outside of the camp, because often in this situation, there's not much distinguishing the situation of people in the poor community near Mahama camp and those living in the refugee camp themselves. And so that's how our model developed. And by June, I had to leave Rwanda since my year working there was over. So our model continued to evolve, whereas we started fundraising in the US, and I started amassing a team of fundraisers and other people who were interested in engaging in this work, while Edward and our team of Rwandan and Burundian youth began to implement the programs in Rwanda and in these communities. And so by January of 2016, after about 6 months of fundraising and community organizing, we launched our first project, which was a tree planting campaign for largely for peace building purposes. One of the issues that we learned about from these discussions with community members, both in the camp and outside of the camp, is that there was a lot of friction happening between the refugees and the local populations due to deforestation of an already highly eroded area for campfires. So as a way to begin this process of shared outcomes of engaging with both refugee populations and local communities at the same time, we decided to launch a tree planting campaign, which is a significant action in Rwanda and often used for peace building purposes, particularly since the genocide. And that was largely successful at identifying key actors that would become the backbone of our work within the camp and also living outside of the camp. But this was largely the way that we were working. As Edward would come, he'd help plant the trees with people and engage in dialogue following off of this. while we would fundraise and find new ways of working and new partnerships through that. And this tree planting campaign led to the establishment of the Tabita Women's Collective. So the primary people who helped with this original campaign were 14 women, 6 of whom were Rwandan, and 8 of whom were Burundian refugees, as well as 2 men. And through this process, they came to us and they pitched an idea for a sewing cooperative. And so we asked them why they'd chosen this idea. And around this time, Rwanda had just passed a decree that they were no longer going to import secondhand clothing in the country, which meant that there was a major gap in supply for clothing and other textile materials. So the women, having heard this news, figured if they could learn how to sew, they could start meeting their own needs by filling this supply gap. And we worked with them a little bit to design a project that would be collaborative within all members of the community and really hammer out the details. And so after a few months, we founded the Tabita Women's Collective in late 2016 and began implementing in 2017 once fundraising came through. So we started with seed funding. 6 women, we were able to pay for 6 women at first, 4 Burundian women and 2 Rwandan local community members. And over time we added additional people, buying them sewing machines, cloth, thread as like a starter kit, and paying for them to get lessons from a local teacher. So one of the things we felt was important was focusing on local resources and in procurement as well, so that we were both supporting the local communities as well as the refugee populations. And we bought from all local vendors, we hired local teachers. The 2 men who helped with the tree planting became the security guards at a local church that allowed us to store the machines. And over time, we continued to add women. And we worked with them as well on financial management services. We gave them a little bit of training and helped set them up with a bank account and a VSLA, which is known in the country as a SACO. And registering that with the government also helped them get additional benefits on a tax-based basis, as well as access to new networks, which is something that we continued to find out as we went along. And since we founded this, we spent around $450 per woman, but by the end we were around, each adding an additional new member was around $300 to $350. But with that investment, people were able to gain around twice the stipends that they were receiving from WHO and other donors in the camp, and meet more than just their basic needs, but also begin saving. So with this VSLA, a lot of the women, since they've been able to give loans to 2 more women, and they have around 10 additional women waiting to join the cooperative. Additionally, they've been able to buy health insurance for 43 members, community members in the camp and outside of the camp, using just the savings that they've created in initially the first 3 months, which is really, really powerful. They've created a community in an area where there was a lot of tension beforehand, and it's now been recognized by the government as a model village in Rwanda for their ability to not just coexist, but thrive and engage with both refugee and local populations. And while we can't take all the credit for that, we were there at the beginning working on pushing forward these shared outcomes approaches. Additionally, the teacher of this women's collective is now sitting on the local humanitarian cluster from time to time. Edward was invited to come and sit on the early recovery cluster about promoting livelihoods, but he felt it would be better to hear from an actual community member who was doing this work. And so she is now there lecturing some of the government officials on how they should be engaging with populations, and it's been pretty effective from that perspective. And but I also recognize that this is a very unique context within which we're working. Rwanda has pretty liberal laws around work for refugee populations. Additionally, there are these existing markets that need to be filled, and the country's relatively peaceful. There's not really any conflict dynamics that would be upsetting the value chains or the ability to work on this type of livelihoods promotion. And that's something that we're looking at as well, because looking towards expanding and trialing these new models it's important to take into account the context. But that being said, we've seen the value of these approaches, of engaging with people on a personal level and empowering them and building their capacity and giving them the tools that they need and that they've identified to meet their own needs rather than coming from a more top-down approach. And so last year in January, we were able to travel to Rwanda, our team of fundraisers and our board to visit both the Tabita project as well as other members of the camp that we've been working with, which it was a really, really successful experience. We spent 12 days, 3 of which we were in the camp, and then a few other days that we were engaging directly with urban refugees, local communities around Mahama camp, and then also with the government to make sure that we had everything in line from a registration standpoint. During these meetings, we listened to the women of Tabita and their experience, and asked them for feedback on how we could improve our programming, which is where this shift towards more of a loan-based model for us that I mentioned a little bit earlier has come from. Many of the women felt that they weren't looking for us to come and give them a few dollars and then for the relationship to end. What they wanted was for us to engage in a consistent and sustainable way with them and treat them as equal partners in this approach rather than as beneficiaries. And so since that time, we've switched to a loan-based system with the Tabita women, and have given them a loan to get an embroidery machine that's allowed them to win contracts with the local government for school uniform tailoring, which has increased their ability to provide for their basic needs and to continue to save. Additionally, we worked with a group of youth farmers in the camp. Jix is the name of their leader, who's now living in Uganda, but at the time, they were looking for support with just the provision of shovels, seeds, and enough money to build a storage center. They'd worked with the local government to acquire a plot of land for free, and we engaged with them and helped them set up effectively this farming cooperative that's now employed around 43 youth in the camp for about $30 a person, which now they're also investing in VSLA programming and are able to meet not just their basic needs, but above that. And we're pretty happy with that experience as well. And that's also given us pathways to engaging with more urban youth in Kigali. Through connections with the youth farmers, we managed to build a network of urban youth living in the capital and are starting to do community organizing meetings with them so that we can start adapting this model to an urban setting and to a non-camp-based setting as well. But this trip was really important for us from a standpoint of monitoring and evaluation and assessing the work that we were doing, as well as building personal relationships with people. Our model is all about dignity and respect, and I think that it was crucial for us to go and meet and engage so that we were building real relationships with people instead of having this faceless entity sending money from time to time. And I think that that's been one of the main successes of our work as well, is the fact that we do have these relationships now, and it's more than just humanitarian response, it's partnership. And so, you may be wondering how I ended up in this situation. So I was asked to talk a little bit about my journey throughout this experience as well. I mentioned earlier that I have no idea what it's like to live as a refugee. I grew up as a farm boy outside of Cleveland, Ohio, which is about as far as you can get from Kigali or from Mahama Camp, Rwanda. I probably couldn't tell you anything about Africa, let alone Rwanda, before I was 13. But that changed in my freshman year of high school. I went to a school in the city. It's not New York, but it was a big city for me. And I worked with a youth a youth group over the summer after my freshman year, in which I was mentoring a young boy from Freetown. And both Sierra Leone and Liberian refugees were commonly moving through Cleveland at the time, so I was able to engage with a few of these displaced communities and learn their stories, and meet with their families and hear what they'd gone through during the Civil War. And this set me down a path through which I became more interested in issues pertaining to human rights and humanitarian response, particularly within Africa. I went to college to study aid. I had these grandiose ideas of going and jumping into a conflict zone, maybe a little bit too Hollywood, but it drove me to learn more, and by the time I graduated college, I've been pretty involved in the Darfur movements as well as peace and human rights campaigns around Congo. And through friends of friends of friends, I managed to get in touch with an organization called PICO Rwanda, which is led by a local Rwandan who learned community organizing approaches in Oakland around '96 and took those back to Rwanda to help with the reconstruction effort after the genocide, and has been largely successful. So this is John Rutsundintwarane. While I may have started out in this process thinking of how I was going to go and engage in communities and how I was going to save the world, for lack of a better term, shortly after my time in Rwanda, I realized that that is incredibly problematic and also not my role or who I wanted to be. What I wanted to do in this field and what I still want to do is lift up the voices and work to support the work being done by people like John here and Edward, our partner at the Rest. John grew up a refugee in Tanzania. He was born in around 1964. He's not really sure. The documentation is not the best in those camps. But he grew up living in the camp, and then by the time 1994 came around, he started working with Lutheran World Relief in the resettlement issues, and through that program he got to go to Eastern Mennonite University to study conflict resolution, from which he got an internship in Oakland using community organizing, and then brought those tools back to Rwanda to engage with local populations. And he's been responsible for getting several different communities in Rwanda named as model villages, using these approaches which focus on local resources rather than external support and building up communities. And that was the foundation from which we developed our work. Edward, his cousin, who I met through this organization, had a similar life. He grew up as a refugee in Tanzania as well. He would travel 8 hours by foot each way for 30 minutes to use a computer. He would travel 4 hours each way to get water to sell in the camp. And growing up in that context, by nature of those experiences, I learned that people like John and Edward and so many others have so much more knowledge and expertise around these issues than I do. And that was one of the driving forces behind the Rest, and one of my key motivations now looking forward to the future. And having seen what people like John and Edward can do with just $1, they can stretch that dollar farther than I could with 100. And they can make so much more impact in their communities because of the experiences that they have, the local knowledge, and their ability to engage with people on this human level. And that's something that I aspire to and continue to think about within the work that we do at the Rest, and also within my studies here at SIPA. Which brings us back here to my studies here at SIPA. So everything that I've done over the past year and a half has shaped the Rest very, very deeply. Through courses like Complex Emergencies, I learned more about the rights-based approach to humanitarian response. I learned the language that we need to use to effectively present ourselves in the best way, and how to talk about the work that we're doing. Like I said, when I started this, I was very, very much an amateur, and I remain that in my opinion as well. But from the experience that I've had at SIPA, learning about the humanitarian enterprise as a whole, and also about the different ways that people are engaging through livelihoods development and other ways of responding to these crises, our organization